Tasha Harris stepped into the courtroom with a mix of nerves and determination, her heels clicking softly against the cold marble floor. She had been here before, but never quite like this today. It was different. She wasn't here for a criminal case or to defend herself against something more serious. This was a simple traffic violation, a speeding ticket. She knew it was unfair, but she had always believed in standing up for herself. She glanced around the room, noting the stern faces of the people sitting quietly in the back waiting their turn in the seats reserved for the public. She felt a brief moment of anxiety, but quickly shook it off. She wasn't going to let this judge intimidate her. As she walked toward the front of the courtroom, her eyes landed on the man sitting behind the bench, Judge Edward Hawthorne. He was a tall man with graying hair, his robe pristine and flowing, his face stern and unreadable. It was the type of face that commanded respect, the type of man whose word in the courtroom was final. His reputation was well known in the community, his decisions often considered unyielding and fair. But to Tasha, he was just another person who had no idea who she truly was or what she was capable of. She wasn't just another woman in a courtroom. She was an accomplished designer known for her work in the fashion industry. She had crafted robes and clothing for professionals from all walks of life. But that wasn't something she expected to be recognized for today. Today, she was here for something far simpler: to have her voice heard. The judge called the case, and Tasha rose from her seat. She stood tall and confident, walking to the front of the room. She gave her name and stated her case. Her car had been going slightly over the speed limit, but the ticket had been issued unfairly, and she knew it. She explained calmly how she had been on her way to an important meeting and had no intention of speeding. She had always followed the rules and respected the law. She wasn't trying to make excuses, but she felt that the fine was excessive and deserved to be reconsidered. Judge Hawthorne listened with a neutral expression, his eyes never leaving her face as she spoke. When she finished, he didn't respond right away. Instead, he made a few notes on the papers in front of him and then spoke, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've reviewed your case, Miss Harris, and while I understand your concerns, I have to uphold the fine," he said, his words final and unyielding. "The fine is to be paid in full by the end of the month." Tasha stood still for a moment, her heart sinking in disbelief. She had hoped for a more understanding response, but it seemed the judge had made his decision. She nodded politely, though inside her frustration grew. She wasn't going to argue. She knew it was pointless. With a final glance at the judge, she turned and walked back to her seat, a sense of frustration building inside her. It wasn't just the fine, it was the feeling that she hadn't been seen or heard, that her voice didn't matter in this space, that she was just another faceless woman in a courtroom filled with powerful men. But little did the judge know this woman was far from ordinary. She was a creator, a designer, a force in her own right, and the very robe he wore every day was her work, something she had crafted with her own hands. As Tasha walked out of the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. The weight of the judge's decision hung heavy on her shoulders, but it wasn't just the fine. It was the way he had dismissed her so easily, as if her voice had no value, as if she was just another person passing through the system, a minor detail in his daily routine. She clenched her fists, a quiet frustration rising in her chest. She had worked hard to get where she was, to build her career, and yet, here she was, treated like just another nameless face. Tasha had never expected special treatment, but today felt different. It wasn't about the money, it wasn't even about the ticket. It was the simple fact that she had been overlooked. And the worst part was, Judge Hawthorne had no idea who she was or the significance of what she had done. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone who had played a quiet but pivotal role in his life. The robe he wore every day, the very symbol of his authority in the courtroom, had been designed and crafted by none other than her. She had created it years ago, long before she had even known his name. Back then, Tasha had been working with a local tailoring company that had received a request from the judicial office. The job had seemed straightforward, a custom robe for a rising judge. She had no reason to believe this was anything more than just another commission, one of many. But it wasn't just any robe. The design she had envisioned for Judge Hawthorne was a reflection of his status, his personality, and his aspirations. It was a robe that blended tradition with modernity, a robe that stood out among the sea of drab judicial garments. When it was finished, it had become a symbol of his professionalism, a garment that many in the courthouse admired. Tasha, however, never sought recognition for her work. She was a humble designer focused on her craft and the satisfaction of her clients. That was the way she had always operated. Her creations spoke for themselves, and she didn't need accolades or attention. She had no idea that one of her robes would go on to become so iconic that it would end up on the back of a judge who was as well known as Hawthorne. To her, it was just another job, another piece in her growing portfolio. But now, as she walked away from the courthouse, the robe had become something far more significant. It had become a symbol of everything she had worked for and everything she felt was being ignored. Tasha thought back to the moment she had designed the robe, pouring every ounce of her skill and passion into it. She had seen the judge as just another person, another client who needed a piece of clothing to signify his position. But in the years since, as her business had grown and her reputation had spread, she had realized how often her work went unnoticed, how she, as a black woman in the fashion industry, had to fight harder than most to gain respect. Even her creations, her masterpieces, were sometimes invisible to the very people who wore them. Judge Hawthorne, with his prestigious position, was no exception. She stopped in her tracks, standing on the sidewalk outside the courthouse. For the first time, it hit her. She had created that robe, and now she was being dismissed as if she didn't matter. The sting of it was sharp, but it also sparked something inside her, a resolve she hadn't fully recognized until now. This wasn't just about the ticket or even the judge. This was about her journey, her fight to be seen, to be recognized for the work she had done. And she wasn't about to let it slide. Tasha couldn't stop thinking about the robe, about the judge, and about the way she had been dismissed so easily in the courtroom. She had been standing there, confident and prepared, hoping for a fair hearing, but instead, all she received was a fine and a sense of invisibility. It wasn't just the ticket. It was the realization that her work, the very fabric of what had elevated the judge's status, was being overlooked. She had created something that symbolized authority, something that had likely been seen by hundreds of people over the years, yet here she was, ignored and dismissed in the very same courthouse. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table, Tasha felt the need to dig deeper. She couldn't let the situation slide. She wasn't just another person in the system. Her work had a lasting impact, and she knew it. It was time to find out more about Judge Edward Hawthorne, the man who had so easily brushed aside her presence. Tasha fired up her laptop and started with a simple search. She quickly found articles and court records, discovering that Judge Hawthorne was a respected figure in the local judicial system. He had been appointed to the bench a decade ago and had built a reputation as a tough but fair judge. His decisions were often praised for their clarity and strength, and he was known for his no-nonsense approach in the courtroom. But it wasn't just his career that caught her attention, it was the robe. She had designed it years ago, back when he was just a rising figure in the legal world. The robe had been one of her first major commissions, and she had poured her heart into the design. She had used luxurious fabric, blending traditional elements with subtle modern touches. The trim was intricate, the fit impeccable. It was a robe that had made Judge Hawthorne stand out in a crowded courtroom, one that made him feel powerful and authoritative. She had never known how much her design had meant to him until now, until she saw him wearing it every day, taking pride in the robe that she had crafted. The more Tasha read, the more she realized just how integral the robe had become to his identity as a judge. She had created something that people admired, something that was a symbol of the justice he stood for, and yet, here he was, a man who had no idea who she was. She felt a surge of frustration, but also something else, something stronger. She had been the one to create that symbol of power, and yet, she was treated like just another faceless individual. The injustice of it hit her hard. Tasha leaned back in her chair, feeling both defeated and determined. She had spent years building her reputation as a designer, carving out a place for herself in a field dominated by others. But here in the courthouse, it felt like none of that mattered. She had been reduced to a nameless woman, someone whose work had been worn and admired, but never acknowledged. She wasn't angry about the fine, not really. It was the fact that Judge Hawthorne had no idea who she was, what she had done. He had looked right past her, and that stung in a way that no fine ever could. It was time to do something about it. Tasha wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to allow herself to be invisible any longer. She had designed that robe. Asterisk his asterisk robe, and she deserved to be seen. She couldn't let him off so easily. Tasha had never been one to stay silent, and now, more than ever, she knew she had to make her voice heard. She wasn't just going to fight this ticket. She was going to fight for the recognition that was long overdue. The judge's robe had been the first step, and now she was ready to take the next one. She would make sure everyone knew who she was and that her work had value. She would make sure Judge Hawthorne knew exactly who had crafted the symbol of his authority. Tasha spent the next few days in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The decision to confront Judge Hawthorne was something she knew she had to do, but how? How would she even approach him? The idea of standing face to face with the judge, the man who had unknowingly worn her design for so long, felt both intimidating and exhilarating. But she knew it wasn't just about the robe. It was about her recognition, her worth, and demanding the respect she had always deserved but had never quite received. She couldn't sit in the shadows any longer. This was her moment. After thinking it over, Tasha decided to take a direct approach. She reached out to the judge's office, requesting a private meeting. She didn't explain why, only that she had something important to discuss. Her heart pounded as she awaited the response. To her surprise, within a few days, she received an email confirming the meeting. The judge's assistant was kind but formal in her message. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. The day of the meeting arrived, and Tasha dressed carefully, professional, but with a touch of her own personal flair. She wore a crisp tailored blazer and black pants, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She wanted to look every bit the designer she was, but also to command respect in that room. As she entered the courthouse once again, her heart raced. This time, she wasn't just another person in the building. She was about to make her presence known. Judge Hawthorne's office was large, with dark wood paneling and shelves of legal books. The room felt heavy, as though it held decades of legal decisions and the weight of the justice system itself. He was seated behind a large desk, his expression as neutral as ever when she walked in. He rose to greet her, his posture rigid, his handshake firm. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "What can I help you with?" Tasha stood still for a moment, taking in the space around her before meeting his gaze. She felt a wave of confidence wash over her. She wasn't here to apologize or plead. She was here to make a statement. "Judge Hawthorne," she began, her voice steady, "I want to talk to you about your robe." His brow furrowed in confusion. "My robe?" he repeated, clearly unsure where this was headed. Tasha nodded. "Yes, the one you've worn in every courtroom appearance. The one you wear for every case you preside over. I designed it." There was a brief silence before he responded, his tone cautious. "I'm not sure what you mean. Are you saying you created the robe I wear in court?" "Yes," Tasha replied, her voice unwavering. "I designed it. Years ago when you were first appointed. I was commissioned to create a new design for the judge's robes, and yours was one of the first I worked on. It was a personal project for me, one I put my heart into. I wanted it to stand out, to reflect the power and the authority of the person who wore it. And that person was you." Judge Hawthorne sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise. He stared at her for a moment, taking in her words. Tasha could see his mind racing as he processed the revelation. For the first time since the trial, she felt as if she had his full attention. "I didn't realize," he said slowly, almost apologetically. "I had no idea it was you. I never knew who designed it. But that robe, it's become a part of me, a symbol of my role as a judge." Tasha crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "And yet, despite wearing it every day, you never bothered to acknowledge the person who created it. You didn't even recognize me when I stood in front of you in your courtroom." The words stung, but she didn't back down. She wasn't asking for an apology, at least not the way he might think. What she wanted was something more profound, something that could shift the balance in her favor. Recognition, respect, Equality. Judge Hawthorne looked at her with a mixture of guilt and realization. I, I never thought about it that way. He admitted, his voice quieter now. I never realized the impact something as simple as a robe could have. Tasha nodded. It's not just the robe, Judge. It's the fact that women like me, women of color, often go unnoticed. We're seen for the work we do, but not for who we are. It's time for that to change. For a moment, the judge was silent, his eyes meeting hers. The weight of her words seemed to settle in the room. Tasha knew the conversation wasn't over, but something had shifted. For the first time, she felt seen. The silence hung in the room for what felt like an eternity. Judge Hawthorne sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on Tasha, his expression thoughtful. She held her ground, not allowing herself to show any sign of hesitation. The room, once filled with the weight of legal text and rulings, now seemed charged with an unspoken understanding. He had heard her, truly heard her, in a way she hadn't expected. I have to admit, he said, breaking the silence, I never gave much thought to the person behind the design. It's just something that's always been there, part of my uniform, so to speak. But I understand now that what you're saying goes beyond the robe. It's about recognition, about seeing people for who they are, not just what they represent. Tasha felt a flicker of something. Maybe it was hope, or maybe just the smallest sense of vindication. She had expected resistance, a defensive response. Instead, she was met with something that felt like genuine reflection. He wasn't just acknowledging her as the designer. He was beginning to understand the larger point she was making, the reason why it mattered so much. It was about visibility, about breaking down the layers of systemic indifference that so often stifled those who were overlooked. You don't know what this means to me, Tasha said, her voice softer now, but still firm. For years, I've poured my heart into my work, and yes, I've found success. But there are times when I feel like I'm still invisible, like my contributions don't matter, especially in spaces like this. The courtroom, the boardroom, the places where decisions are made. They are still dominated by people who don't always recognize the value of someone like me. And that's what's frustrating. It's not just about my work, it's about my worth. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. I can't imagine what that must be like, he said, his voice thoughtful. To feel overlooked, to feel like your work is taken for granted. But I'm listening now, Tasha, and I can promise you this. This conversation will stay with me. There was sincerity in his voice, but Tasha knew this was only the beginning. It wasn't enough for him to simply acknowledge her now, in this moment. She needed him to carry this understanding forward, to take action, to change the way he interacted with the world. The robe was just the symbol, but it was the attitude toward people like her that needed a shift. She didn't need pity. She didn't need charity. What she needed was recognition, not just for the work she had done, but for who she was in the space she had carved out in a world that hadn't always welcomed her. I don't expect anything from you, Judge, Tasha said, her voice now steady again. But what I would hope for is that you recognize that my work matters, that it's part of something bigger. I'm here to be seen, not just as a designer, but as a person with a story, with experiences, and with a voice. He nodded slowly. I understand, and I won't forget this conversation. I will be more mindful in the future. Tasha stood, her resolve solidifying. This wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it was a small win. It was the beginning of a shift, a crack in the armor of a system that often kept people like her on the margins. She wasn't sure where this conversation would take her, but she knew one thing for certain: she had made her mark. As she walked out of the judge's office, she felt lighter than she had in days. She didn't need to convince him of her worth. She had done that already. What mattered was that she had stood up, made herself heard, and, for the first time, felt truly seen. The road ahead was still long, but now it seemed a little more possible. Tasha walked out of Judge Hawthorne's office with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The weight she had been carrying, the frustration of being unseen, seemed to lighten with each step. She had done what she set out to do. She had made herself heard, and perhaps, just as importantly, she had made the judge see her as more than just a designer. For the first time in a long while, Tasha felt that her voice had mattered, that her story, her journey, was worth hearing. As she walked through the courthouse corridors, her thoughts began to swirl. She knew the conversation with Judge Hawthorne wasn't a cure-all, that it wouldn't fix the systemic issues she faced, but it had been a start. He had promised to be more mindful, to acknowledge the contributions of those like her. And that was a victory, even if small. For Tasha, it was proof that standing up for yourself could create change, even in the most unexpected places. But there was something else she couldn't shake, the realization that there was more work to be done. There was a long list of people like her, overlooked and dismissed, who needed to have their stories heard too. It wasn't enough to have just one conversation. This needed to be part of a larger movement, a shift in how people, especially women of color, were viewed and treated in their professional spaces. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the women whose brilliance was hidden in plain sight. Over the next few weeks, Tasha channeled her energy into something new, a campaign. She began using her platform as a designer to share stories of other overlooked and underestimated professionals. She posted about the incredible work of other women of color in creative industries, in the corporate world, and beyond. Her social media platforms became a space for empowerment, where she celebrated the achievements of others and encouraged them to share their stories too. The hashtag Seen and Heard quickly caught on, and soon it became a movement, small at first, but with a growing momentum. As the campaign gained traction, Tasha found herself more involved in the conversations she had hoped to spark. She started to speak at events and panels, sharing her experiences and advocating for more inclusive spaces in design, fashion, and other industries. She was approached by journalists and even other judges who wanted to learn more about her perspective on representation and the importance of acknowledgement. Tasha was building something powerful, something that went beyond a single conversation in Judge Hawthorne's office. One afternoon, a few months after her meeting with the judge, Tasha received an unexpected message. It was from him. He had reached out to thank her again for their conversation, and he mentioned that he had taken her words to heart. He had started having discussions with his colleagues about representation in the courtroom, not just in the people who worked there, but in the very systems that upheld the law. He told her that he had taken the initiative to feature diverse artists and creators in the courthouse, displaying their work to highlight the richness of the community. He had even invited Tasha to design a special robe for an upcoming ceremony honoring local artists. The message was more than just words. It was an action. It was a shift. Judge Hawthorne was following through on his promise to be more mindful, to use his position of influence to create a space for people like Tasha, whose work and lives had often been pushed to the margins. For the first time in a long time, Tasha felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had started a ripple effect, one that had the potential to grow into something far bigger than she had imagined. She wasn't just changing how one judge saw her. She was changing how people like her were seen, heard, and valued. As she reflected on how far she had come, Tasha knew that this was only the beginning. There was so much more to be done. But for now, she could stand tall, knowing that her fight had made a difference, not just for herself, but for all those who would come after her. Months had passed since Tasha's initial confrontation with Judge Hawthorne, and her life had taken a new, unexpected turn. What started as a personal challenge to be seen and acknowledged had transformed into a larger movement, a call for recognition and respect for those who often went unnoticed. The hashtag Seen and Heard had grown beyond her own platform, spreading to other industries and inspiring countless others to share their stories of overcoming marginalization. Tasha's design business had flourished as well. She had been approached by a number of high-profile clients, artists, politicians, and entrepreneurs who resonated with her message and were eager to work with her. Her creations, once seen as just functional pieces of clothing, were now recognized as powerful symbols of personal identity and cultural pride. People were no longer just admiring her work for its aesthetic appeal. They were valuing it for the messages it conveyed, for the story each piece told. It was during one of these high-profile meetings that Tasha began to see the ripple effects of her advocacy. She was meeting with a prominent fashion influencer, Andrea Williams, who had reached out to collaborate. Andrea had a massive following and had used her platform to champion diverse voices in the fashion world. As they discussed their potential partnership, Andrea leaned forward with a thoughtful expression. You know, Tasha, Andrea began, I've been following your journey closely. I saw how you sparked the conversation with Judge Hawthorne and how it's grown into something bigger. I have to say, it's inspiring. You've done more than just design clothes. You've started a movement. Tasha smiled, grateful for the recognition, but it was the next thing Andrea said that stuck with her. You're creating a platform for other people, other designers who have been ignored. You're making sure their voices are heard too. It hit Tasha in that moment just how much had changed. This wasn't just her personal journey anymore, it was a collective effort. Women, particularly women of color, were being given the space to be heard, to showcase their talents, and to share their stories. The movement was larger than she had ever anticipated, but it was exactly what she had envisioned. As their meeting continued, Andrea suggested that they collaborate on a fashion event, one that would celebrate diversity in the industry. We'll call it the Visible Collection, Andrea said with excitement. We'll highlight designers from underrepresented backgrounds and give them a platform to showcase their work. It's time the industry took a long, hard look at the talent that's been overlooked for too long. The idea resonated deeply with Tasha. She had always believed in the power of community, of lifting others up, and now she had the opportunity to help amplify voices that had been silenced for far too long. The event would be more than just a fashion show. It would be a statement, a declaration that the industry was ready for change. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Tasha and Andrea worked tirelessly to curate the event, bringing together a diverse group of designers, artists, and influencers. The lineup of designers was incredible. Each one had a unique perspective, a different story to tell, but all of them shared one thing in common. They had been underestimated, overlooked, and now they were about to be seen. The night of the event arrived, and the venue was packed. The room buzzed with excitement as models walked the runway, each outfit telling a story of resilience, strength, and creativity. Tasha watched from the side, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. This was what it was all about. This was why she had fought so hard for recognition. It wasn't just for herself. It was for all the people who had been told their work wasn't good enough, for those who had been ignored simply because of who they were. As the show ended, Tasha stood, clapping along with the audience, her heart full. The night was a success, a celebration of what could happen when people were given the space to shine. She knew that the fight for visibility wasn't over, but tonight they had made a powerful statement. And as she stood in that room, surrounded by creators whose work had been celebrated, Tasha knew that she had played a pivotal role in shifting the narrative. The world was beginning to see, truly see, people like her. And that was only the beginning. The success of Asterisk, the Visible Collection Asterisk, was just the beginning of something much larger. As the event concluded, the buzz around Tasha's name and her movement continued to grow. Media outlets were quick to pick up on the story, how a simple design had sparked a conversation about the visibility of marginalized voices in fashion and beyond. Articles poured in, and interviews followed. Tasha had become a beacon of change in an industry that had long struggled with inclusivity. But even as the world recognized her efforts, Tasha knew that there was still so much more to be done. The night of the fashion event had been a huge milestone, but it had only revealed the depth of the issue. How many talented individuals were still fighting to be seen, still pushing for acknowledgement in spaces where they were too often ignored? The world was listening, but Tasha was determined to make sure they kept listening, that they didn't forget the voices that had been silenced for so long. She started traveling more, speaking at conferences and panels, collaborating with artists and designers around the world who shared her mission. Each conversation, each interaction, reinforced her belief that change was possible, that the barriers which had once kept her and others like her on the sidelines could be broken. One afternoon, Tasha received a letter. It was from Judge Hawthorne. The letter was polite, formal, and filled with gratitude. He expressed admiration for her campaign and how it had grown into a movement that reached far beyond the courtroom. He also invited her to participate in an upcoming event, a conference on diversity and inclusion in the judicial system. The judge had taken her words to heart, and his actions showed it. He had worked behind the scenes to implement changes in his courtroom, seeking out diverse voices for consultation and creating programs to encourage mentorship for young people from underrepresented communities. He even credited Tasha with inspiring him to be more mindful of how he approached both his professional responsibilities and the people he encountered. Reading the letter, Tasha felt a deep sense of validation. It wasn't just about getting an apology or recognition for herself anymore. It was about the changes she had sparked, the ripple effect she had created. When she had stood before Judge Hawthorne in his office months ago, she had made a choice to speak up. And now that choice was echoing across the lives of others in ways she had never imagined. The conference that followed was unlike anything Tasha had experienced before. It was filled with people from all walks of life: judges, lawyers, advocates, and activists, all there to discuss how systems of power and authority could be reshaped to become more inclusive. Tasha spoke on a panel, sharing her story of how a small moment in a courtroom had led to a larger movement, how her design had become a symbol of what was possible when people dared to demand recognition. Her words were met with applause, but it was the conversations that followed that truly moved her. Young women, particularly women of color, came up to her afterward to thank her for her work. Some spoke of how they had been inspired to enter careers in law, fashion, and business, while others shared stories of their own struggles to be seen. Tasha listened intently, her heart swelling with pride as she realized just how many people were now empowered to keep pushing forward. As the conference came to a close, Tasha found herself standing in front of a large mural, one that had been painted in celebration of diversity in the judicial system. The mural depicted various influential figures from different walks of life, their faces filled with strength and resolve. In the center of the mural, there was an image of a judge wearing the robe she had designed. It was a subtle, yet powerful tribute to the path she had forged. Tasha smiled softly, a sense of peace washing over her. This journey had started with a simple encounter in a courtroom, but now it was something far greater. She had created a space where stories were told, where people were truly seen. The fight wasn't over, but as she looked at the mural, Tasha knew that she had already made a lasting impact. And in that moment, she realized that this was what it meant to be truly visible.